Sadhu Sundar Singh, Call of God, Chapter 13, Obediency by Suffering. Quote, Yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered, unquote. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 8, quote, I count all things but loss, that I may know him, and the fellowship of his suffering, unquote. Philippians chapter 3, verse 8 and 10. No one but Sadhu Sundar Singh himself knows how great have been his sufferings during his years of service for his master. He admits that very often he has gone without proper food, being reduced to eating the berries and produce of the jungle, and many a night he has been driven from the villages and been obliged to sleep under trees or in caves of the earth. The parts of India where the chief of his work has been done are no places for such a life, so that it is not surprising that on more than one occasion the Sadhu has shared his miserable shelter with a snake or wild animal. At a village in the district of Thoria, the people behaved so badly to him that his nights were always spent in the jungle as long as he was working among them. On a particular dark night, after a discouraging hard day, the Sadhu found a cave where he spread his blanket and lay down to sleep. When daylight came, it revealed the horrible spectacle of a large leopard still asleep close to him. The sight almost paralyzed him with fear. But once outside the cave, he could only reflect upon the great providence of God that had preserved him while he slept. His own words are, quote, Never to this day has any wild animal done me any harm, unquote. On another occasion, being driven out of a certain village, Sundar went to meditate on a rock close to a cave. Deep in contemplation, it was some time before he noticed that he was being stealthily observed by a black panther that was crouching not far away. Filled with fear, but putting his trust in God, he quietly rose and walked forward as if nothing were there. He got away safely to the village, and when the people knew of his escape, they declared he must be a very holy man, since that very panther had killed several people from that village. They then gathered around to receive the message which they had spurned before, and so Sundar again thanked God and took courage. One morning, a number of sadhus were gathered on the banks of the Ganges at a place called Rishi, R-I-S-H-E, and then K-E-S-H, amongst a crowd of religious bathers, and among them stood Sadhu Sundar Singh, testament in hand, preaching. Some were listening in a mildly interested way, while others joked and scoffed at the man and his message. Unexpectedly, a man from the crowd lifted up a handful of sand and threw it in his eyes, an act that roused the indignation of a better-disposed man, who handed the offender over to a policeman. Meanwhile, the Sadhu went down to the river and washed the sand from his eyes. Upon his return, he begged for the release of the culprit and proceeded with his preaching. Surprised by this act and the way he had taken the insult, the man, capital B-I-D-Y-A-N-A-N-D-A, fell at his feet, begging his forgiveness and declaring a desire to understand more of what the Sadhu was speaking about. This man became a seeker after truth and afterwards accompanied him on his journey, learning with meekness from his lips the story of redeeming love. Very early in his pilgrimages, Sundar traveled through a number of villages, one of which was called Duwade. The day had been a hard one, the march very long, and the Sadhu arrived, utterly exhausted and badly in need of food and rest. Walking down the village street, he asked again and again for some shelter where he might spend the night. But in every place, when it was discovered that he was a Christian, he was driven away. Heavy rain was falling, and it was bitterly cold. Wearied almost to death, Sundar sought refuge in a ruined hut of 2 rooms, without doors or windows. At least he was out of the rain, and thanking God, he laid his blanket in the dry spot and went hungry to bed. Soon he fell asleep, and he did not wake until the chilly gray dawn came. In the half-darkness, he saw a black object coiled up in his blanket close beside him, and looking closer, he discovered that a huge cobra had also sought shelter and warmth beside him. Speedily he escaped from the hut, leaving the snake asleep, but on further thought he returned. Seizing a corner of the blanket, he shook it free of the venomous reptile, which stubbornly wriggled off to the furthest corner of the room. Sundar then took his blanket with a feeling of great thankfulness that God had taken care of him in the hours of sleep and spared him for further service. An educated ARYA, then capital SAMAJ, gentleman relates how one day when he was descending a mountain, he met a young sadhu going up. Curiosity prompted him to watch what would happen, so instead of joining him for a talk, as he at first thought of doing, he waited, and this was what he saw. When the sadhu got to the village, he sat down upon a log, and wiping the perspiration from his face, he commenced singing a Christian hymn. Soon a crowd gathered, but when it was found that the love of Christ was the theme, many of the people became angry. One man jumped up and dealt him with such a severe blow as felled him to the ground, cutting his cheek and hand badly. Without a word, Sundar rose and bound up his bleeding hand, and with blood running down his face, prayed for his enemies and spoke to them of the forgiving love of Christ. In writing of this incident, this gentleman adds that he himself, by seeing the sadhu's conduct, was, quote, drawn out of the well of contempt and brought to the fountain of life, unquote. The man, Kripa, and then Ram, who had thrown Sundar down, sought long and earnestly for him in the hope that he might be baptized by, quote, that wounded hand, unquote. But not finding him, he openly confessed Christ by baptism and still hopes to see Sadhu Sundar Singh someday. End of chapter 13, having been read by Peter John Paresis.